Alone. A horror story. Marta, a young woman in her 20s, had just returned home after a long day at work. She lived alone in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, where peace and quiet were the norm. The evening promised to be calm. She planned to watch a movie and unwind before another busy day. As the sun dipped below the horizon and night embraced the city, Marta settled onto her couch with a steaming cup of tea. The apartment was eerily silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. She immersed herself in the movie's plot, her mind drifting further into its world until a faint knock on the door startled her. It was so soft that at first she thought it was just a sound from the TV. But then it came again, a little louder this time. Her heart began to race. Who could it be at this hour? She wasn't expecting anyone, and her neighbors rarely visited unannounced. Hesitantly, she approached the door and peered through the peephole. The hallway outside was empty. She thought it might be a prank. Kids sometimes like to knock and run. She decided to return to her movie. As she walked back to the couch, the TV suddenly flickered, the screen distorting into static before returning to the movie. The interruption was brief, but it left Marta on edge. She glanced around the room, but everything seemed normal, even though a deep unease began to settle in her stomach. The sound of dripping water echoed from the bathroom. Marta frowned, knowing she hadn't used the faucet recently. She stood up again, her footsteps unnaturally loud in the quiet apartment, and made her way to the bathroom. The sink was dry, but the dripping persisted, each drop seeming to echo louder than the last. She leaned over the sink, staring at the drain, but there was nothing. When she looked up, her reflection in the mirror was distorted, her face twisted into a grimace of fear that she wasn't feeling, at least not yet. She blinked, and the reflection returned to normal. Shaken, she turned all the light and left the bathroom, but the dripping continued behind her. Returning to the living room, Marta couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It was a persistent, nagging sensation, as if eyes were following her every move. She quickly checked the locks on the windows and doors, finding them all secure. But as she moved through the apartment, shadows seemed to shift in the corners of her. Vision, just out of reach. Each time she turned to look, there was nothing there, just the familiar furniture and the cold, empty spaces between them. The sensation grew stronger when she entered the kitchen. She stopped in her tracks as she noticed that every single cabinet door was slightly ajar. She was certain they had been closed earlier. Cautiously, she walked over and began shutting them, one by one. But as she closed the last door, the first one creaked open behind her. A wave of panic washed over her as she quickly shut it again, backing out of the kitchen. But the doors remained stubbornly ajar, as if something inside didn't want them to stay closed. Back in the living room, Marta grabbed her phone from the Coley table, intending to call a friend for reassurance. But when she picked it up, the screen was covered in tiny cracks, like a spider web, even though she hadn't dropped it. The screen flickered to life, displaying a series of blurred photos of her apartment, taken from within, from angles she didn't recognize. The last one was of her, standing frozen in the middle of the living room, looking terrified just as she was now. A cold sweat broke out on Marta's back. Someone had been in the apartment. But where were they now? Her thoughts raced as she suddenly heard the same soft sound, a knock, but this time it came from inside the bedroom. Holding her breath, she slowly turned her head. The closet door was slightly open, and the darkness inside seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Marta walked towards it with trembling hands and, with unimaginable elort, swung the door wide open. Inside were just her clothes, nothing else. But just behind her, in the mirror on the closet door, she saw the silhouette of a figure standing directly behind her. She screamed, spinning around immediately, but no one was there. She stood in the empty room, breathing heavily, her heart pounding like a drum. Was it just her imagination? She tried to convince herself it was, but the air in the room grew colder, and the lights began to flicker. Shadows stretched and contorted along the walls, taking on grotesque shapes that seemed almost human. She heard a faint whispering, like the rustle of leaves, but the words were indistinguishable. They grew louder, more insistent, until they were almost deafening. She clutched her head, trying to block out the sound, but it only grew stronger, drowning out her own thoughts. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. Marta felt a soft touch on her shoulder. She froze. It's just the wind, she thought, but an inner voice screamed that it was something more. She wanted to run, but something held her back. The image in the mirror shifted. Now it reflected the window, where a familiar figure stood outside. It was Marta, but with a sinister smile on her face. The lights in the apartment began to flicker, and the room was enveloped in a silence so deep that even her own breath seemed muted. When Marta looked back at her reflection, she was completely alone again, but the feeling of being watched remained. The knocking echoed again, this time deep in her mind, somewhere she didn't dare explore. Or maybe it wasn't knocking, but laughter. Laughter that would follow her always.